Hello, everybody, and welcome to Psyched Out, a podcast focused on all things psychology, like psychological thrillers, unethical experiments, true crime cults, and more. I am your host, Emily, and for those who don't know, I have a bachelor's degree in forensic psychology and a background in law enforcement. This helps me provide unique insight on some of the world's most famous cases, movies, and events. In today's episode, we'll be talking about the Tylenol murders. I know I'm a little bit late to the party on this one, but I finally got around to watching the Netflix documentary, and I think there's a lot of very interesting talking points. So, the plan for this episode is to discuss the case as a whole while weighing in on the pathology of a prospective mass murder with poison, the pathology behind terrorism, and why I believe the main suspect, James Lewis, is actually innocent of the Tylenol murders. So, buckle up, get some snacks, hunker down. It's going to be a bit of a long episode, but before we dive in, I just want to say happy Pride Month, everybody, from your favorite bisexual host. You guys deserve to be seen, you deserve to be heard, you deserve to exist. Have a good month. Take care of each other. I want to do something charity based for Pride Month. I haven't figured it out yet. So if any of you guys have suggestions, please let me know. I was thinking of making like a Pride version of the channel logo, selling it as a sticker, and then donating the proceeds to a specific LGBT charity. But I'm not set on that idea. So if you guys have any suggestions, let me know because I do want to do something to support the community. But before I get too in the weeds, thank you guys for being here. We're going to go ahead and jump on in. The Tylenol murders, otherwise known as the Chicago Tylenol murders, began on September 12, 1982, when a 12-year-old by the name of Mary Kellerman was kept home from school due to feeling ill. Something that so many parents have done, something that so many kids have experienced. However, this wasn't a typical situation. While home, Mary took some extra strength Tylenol, as many people do. Dennis Kellerman, Mary's father, recounted the incident stating, quote, "I heard her go into the bathroom. I heard the door close. Then I heard something drop. I went to the bathroom door. I called, 'Mary, are you okay?' There was no answer. I called again, 'Mary, are you okay?' There was still no answer. So I opened the bathroom door, and my little girl was on the floor unconscious. She was still in her pajamas." End quote. One of the paramedics on the call with Mary was Dave Spung. Now, Dave was said to be an exceptional paramedic, and he threw everything that he could from the drug box into Mary's tiny little body in hopes of making a difference, but nothing worked. For those who aren't familiar with paramedics, I mean, they have these gigantic plastic containers that have insulin, adrenaline, all sorts of drugs to try and jumpstart the system. And it sounds like they did everything they could and it was just unsuccessful. At 9:56 a.m., Mary Kellerman was pronounced deceased at Alexian Brothers Medical Center in Elk Grove Village. Mary would be the first death attributed to the Tylenol murders, but at this time, nobody knew how big of a crisis this would turn into. As if Mary's sudden death wasn't startling enough, 6 other people would die within the span of a few days due to taking extra strength Tylenol. And one of the next victims was a 27-year-old mailman, Adam Janis, who, like Mary, wasn't feeling well when he woke up for work, except, he may have had a head cold. Mary may have had a head cold. Regardless, they weren't feeling well. And so, like any normal individual, they went to take some Tylenol. So Adam went to a store in Arlington Heights known as Jewel Osco where he bought extra strength Tylenol. At this time, like I said, nobody knew that there were any issues with Tylenol or that it may have been tainted. Adam consequently took the Tylenol and then collapsed at his home shortly after consuming the medication. At first, the Janis family was told Adam's heart failed, which was confusing in and of itself as Adam was a healthy young man. Like most 27-year-olds don't die from heart attacks without some sort of pre-indicator in their medical history. Can it happen? Sure, but it just seemed really weird. Adam's niece, Monica, would later state, quote, "When they told my family that he died from a heart attack, they couldn't believe it. They were like, why would he die from a heart attack?" End quote. And in a cruel twist of fate, the family returned to Adam's home still grief-stricken from the hospital, whereas Stanley Janis, Adam's brother, who was only 25 at the time, took some extra-strength Tylenol from the bottle that Adam had bought. Stanley's wife, Teresa, did the same thing. Joe Janis, the third Janis brother, recalled the scene shortly after Stanley took the Tylenol. Quote, "He just fell down, and when he fell, his mouth, this white stuff was coming from his mouth. His eyes turned backwards. I seen, so they called the ambulance," end quote. Honestly, I can't imagine how scary that must have been to see because it's not something that you really prepare yourself for when it comes to your loved ones. Like most people don't stay up at night going, "Oh, I wonder what would happen if they just fell over and started foaming at the mouth." Like you don't expect people that you love, especially somebody as young as 25, that's how old I am. You don't expect them to collapse and just start foaming at the mouth. Like that just doesn't happen. So it must have been very scary and honestly very confusing, especially because they just lost Adam in the same way. And to make matters worse, not only did Stanley end up collapsing, but Teresa also collapsed shortly after the ambulance arrived to help Stanley. And both of them would pass away within the span of a day. Three others would die in the days afterwards, the victims being a brand new mother. Well, this was her fourth baby, but still a brand new mother when you look at how soon she delivered her baby. And her name was Mary Reiner, and she was 27 of Winfield. Lombard, and then there was a phone center employee named Mary McFarland, who was 31, and a flight attendant named Paula Jean Prince, 35, of the Old Town neighborhood. While the tragedy that consumed the public at this time, and the Janus family in particular, was immense, the Janus family deaths are the reason the Tylenol was ever identified as being contaminated. So, as much as it sucks to have lost three loved ones, there's a good chance that more people would have been hurt before the cause of death being Tylenol was ever discovered. So it's a weird, tragic twist, and unfortunately, a little cosmic irony that it took three people dying in the same family to honestly prevent future deaths as well. Now, Chuck Kramer, a fire lieutenant who responded to Adam Janus's home, was present not only for Adam's death, but that of Stanley, and then transporting Teresa to the hospital. Teresa actually ended up on life support for quite a while before ultimately passing away. Now, his suspicions peaked automatically due to the deaths being concentrated to one family. Like, that's just weird. That doesn't really happen unless it's like an outright murder or outright murder suicide. And as a result, he was able to narrow down what may have caused the three quick and successive deaths. This was done with the help of a retired nurse by the name of Helen Jensen, who described the moment Chuck Kramer contacted her, stating, quote, "I got a phone call from the fire department from Chuck Kramer," end quote. While speaking with Chuck, they were able to determine that all three victims had taken extra strength Tylenol from the same bottle, which existed in Adam's home. And with such a major and concerning breakthrough, Jensen rushed back to the hospital where the three victims were transported. Jensen presented her case to authorities and hospital staff, but they didn't believe her. Jensen stated, quote, "I went back to the emergency room, presented it to the medical examiner and the police, and they laughed at me," end quote. And to be completely blunt, that's ridiculous. If I was told that three people in the same family suddenly and mysteriously died, I'd not only be concerned about the fact that that happened in the first place, I'd be open to any possible leads. And to be honest, it's not that far fetched that a pharmacy drug could have caused something like this. Machines do a lot of the heavy lifting in pharmaceuticals now compared to back then. There was still a lot of human error. I mean, there's still a lot of human error now. Back when I was taking ADHD medication, the pharmacist gave me the wrong prescription. It was for a completely different type of medication. And the only reason I caught it is because when I brought it home, I was like, hey, these capsules don't look the same. Some people don't pay attention. They would have just taken it. You just take whatever your dosage is and you pop it in your mouth. And this is in the 21st century, right? So imagine what it was like back then. The other thing we have to consider is like not only could the drugs have been mixed up, dosages, etc., like if it got contaminated with something else, what if this was just a massive allergic reaction? Allergies tend to be genetic. What if it was just that all three of them went into anaphylactic shock? Like you don't know. And so it just seems like it would be worth investigating regardless because who's it going to hurt, right? Either it is the Tylenol and you catch it early and it doesn't hurt other people and you can jump on this a little bit sooner, or it's not the Tylenol, and then you go, okay, great, it's not the Tylenol, and you move on to something else. But that's not what happened. They didn't jump on this as soon as they should have. Jensen was able to locate the Tylenol bottle at the Janus household, as I mentioned, and she counted the missing pills, which totaled 6. And if you do basic math, that means like 2 pills per victim, which is pretty common. Most people, when they take Tylenol, especially if it's extra strength, they're going to take 1 or maybe 2. Jensen explained, quote, "I also went through the garbage and found the receipt that this was purchased at Jewel that morning. I'm holding it, the bottle and the receipt, and I laid it out in front of the medical examiner and I counted it again and told him the same thing. There are 6 capsules missing. There are 3 people dead. There has to be a correlation." End quote. The fact that she had to do the detective work here is infuriating because she shouldn't be the one going through the garbage or trying to determine what intersects between all 3 victims. This is something that investigators and officers should have done. I don't know why they didn't, but I'm glad that Jensen did it because if it hadn't been done, this would have been a very different story. But it's infuriating to know that she was the one who had to do it because other people weren't doing their job. So kudos to Jensen because without her and Chuck, this could have been way worse than it actually was. And while Jensen was investigating the Tylenol side of things, Chuck asked around about the death of 12-year-old Mary Kellerman, and he was able to learn that the symptoms which preceded her death were identical to that of the Janis family and the symptoms that preceded their deaths. Chuck also learned that Mary had taken extra-strength Tylenol, so Chuck went to report his findings the same way Jensen had, but was also dismissed. The next morning, the news broke that Tylenol was responsible for the deaths of 4 people: Mary, Adam, Stanley, and Teresa. Prior to this, an autopsy was underway with Mary. Edmund Donahue, the deputy chief medical examiner for Cook County, stated there wasn't anything too suspicious about Mary's death, which feels like a joke because, again, most 12-year-olds don't randomly fall over and die in a matter of moments. Like, that just doesn't happen. So, the fact that she died in the first place in her own home after she felt a little bit ill, that should be suspicious in and of itself. Then, to make matters worse and even more frustrating, Dr. Kim, who was also investigating the deaths at the hospital, stated Jensen, quote, he said that Jensen said, quote, "Maybe it's the Tylenol," end quote. And then he stated, "I thought, well, that's fine. But at the time, that was just someone saying that. And I was very frustrated and I was very desperate. How come I can't figure out what is wrong with these people?" End quote. Like, this feels like a joke because I just shake my head. And this is speculation on my part, but the only reason I can think that he so easily gave Jensen the middle finger and told her to just get lost is because, one, she's a nurse and he's a doctor. So he's likely thinking that she doesn't know anything and he's the one to figure it out because he's the doctor and she's just a nurse and also she's retired. And then, two, he's a man and she's a woman and women don't know anything. But I can't imagine not even considering what someone is saying to you because what does it do to who does it hurt to investigate the theory? Who does it affect? Who does it negatively impact? It is just so frustrating because you have the medical examiner being like, "Oh, a 12-year-old just randomly died. That's not suspicious." And then you have this doctor being like, "Oh my God, what could it be?" And you have somebody saying, "Hey, I'm pretty sure this is the problem. This is between all 4 victims. All 4 victims had this happen." And the doctor's like, "Oh my gosh, I really wish I knew the answer." Like, it's almost comedic because of how stupid it is. It's so hard not to get mad about it. Anyways, investigator Pishos, I think that's how you say his name, who was assisting Jensen and medical examiner Donahue at the time, managed to track down the other Tylenol bottle from Mary's case, which the fire department had actually inventoried because law enforcement didn't, which again is a little bit weird, but kudos to the fire department. Pishos said, quote, "When I got the Tylenol bottle, I looked and saw the control numbers were the same. I reported back to the medical examiner's office and I said, look, everything here is different except this. Both have Tylenol bottles and they both had the same control number, MC2880, end quote. The bottles allegedly smelled like almonds, which is a distinguishing scent of cyanide. Ironically, only about 50% of the population can actually smell cyanide. By this time, Dr. Kim had sent blood tests to a separate lab, which was able to confirm the presence of 110 to 100,000 times the amount of cyanide required to kill someone in the victims, Mary, Adam Stanley, and Teresa. By now, Mary McFarland and Mary Reiner were also pronounced deceased at their respective hospitals. Roy Dames, CEO of Cook County's medical examiner's office, recounted that he talked to the CEO of the company that made Tylenol, which is Johnson & Johnson, and informed the CEO that the authorities were going to have a press conference. Roy Dames stated the CEO asked, quote, "Do you have to?" end quote, and he replied, "Well, do you have a better idea?" To which the CEO said, "No." When I tell you that this is infuriating, it's an understatement. and quite frankly, I shouldn't be surprised that a CEO would be asking this because capitalism means profit over human life and everything like that. But like, come on, right? Multiple people are dying from your product and you're concerned about saving face. You're concerned about the public freaking out. Like, get it together, right? The only reason you don't care is because you want the money and because it hasn't directly impacted you or your family. That's why you don't care. And you don't want to lose your profits, you don't want to lose your stock, but it's like one life is too many as far as this goes, as far as I'm concerned. Like, it's just so infuriating that he's like, "Oh, well, only 6 people died. Do we really have to tell the public? I'm concerned about my wallet." The lack of care for the victims is just very upsetting. Very upsetting. And I think the one statement of him asking, "Well, do you have to?" is very telling. Very telling. So, due to the determination that Tylenol was responsible for the deaths, a media release was put together to warn the public that Tylenol was contaminated with cyanide and not to take it. Now, if you weren't irritated before, this next part is also going to be irritated, but I think part of it is because they were trying to prevent mass panic. But at this point, I feel like mass panic is probably a little warranted. So, medical examiner Donahue stated that he didn't push for a recall of Tylenol because he didn't feel it was necessary. And in my opinion, I think that having 6 people die from contaminated Tylenol that's contaminated with cyanide, is a fantastic reason to have a recall. But again, these were different times, and we'll learn that a lot has changed due to this incident because there's regulations now on package seals and tamper-proof packaging. On September 30th, Johnson & Johnson recalled all Tylenol products from the contaminated lot number located by investigator Pishos. On October 1st, while federal agencies became involved with the incident, police discovered the body of Paula Prince in her Old Town apartment at 1540 North LaSalle Street. I think that's how you pronounce it. Now, Joan Ahern, a United flight attendant and friend of Prince, recounted that Paula's sister was supposed to meet her for dinner, and Paula wasn't answering her telephone, which naturally alerted her sister that something just wasn't right. And what Joan understood is that Paula was due back on Friday for work, and she was actually a no-show for a flight. Richard Burchek, superintendent of the Chicago Police Department, stated that her family couldn't reach her, and they called the Chicago police to do what is a welfare check or a well-being check. And what they found was a Tylenol bottle sitting open on Paula's vanity. She ultimately took it in the bathroom, took the Tylenol, and then by the time she got to the threshold of the door, she had died. Due to Paula's death, the mayor of Chicago made the decision to pull all Tylenol off the shelves in Chicago, something that should have been done sooner, in my opinion, by other authorities, not the mayor. But I'm glad that Mayor Byrne interceded, since up until this point, no other agency cared enough to do this and protect the public. While the government continued to investigate, Johnson & Johnson began an investigation on themselves, which is pretty ass backwards. Like, at this point in time, no one knew if it was a person who'd caused the contamination or the company itself. And if the company itself is a suspect, why in God's name would you allow them to not only investigate themselves, but go through evidence completely unchecked by another government agency? Like, it just doesn't make sense. So while Johnson & Johnson is doing their own bullshit investigation, law enforcement identifies a suspect by the name of James Lewis. Now, there's a little bit extra to how they came to know it was James Lewis. I highly recommend you watch the documentary, just because it's a lot to get into. But James Lewis fell on the FBI's radar when he wrote an extortion letter to Johnson & Johnson demanding $1 million to stop the killings. Lewis was convicted of this and served, I think it's 10 or 12 years in prison. Lewis made himself even more of a suspect when he attempted to explain how someone might add cyanide to the Tylenol bottles before returning them to the shelves. I actually didn't know this, but it's very easy, or at least it was back then, to separate the gel portions or the capsule portions of Tylenol. So you just pull them apart, you would put something in, and then you'd push them back together. And that's basically what Lewis was saying, is like, well, if somebody really wanted to do this, this is how they would do it. And then for those who don't know, package sealing wasn't much of a thing at the time, so it would have been very easy to walk into a store, take a bottle of medication, open it, add whatever you wanted, close it without anybody really knowing the difference. And obviously now we have like so much tamper-proofing it's insane. Sometimes it's almost annoying, but this case really like contributed to that change so that people weren't dying left and right from cyanide Tylenol. Now, when it came to the extortion letter, Lewis wrote it demanding the $1 million sum be sent to his wife's former employer's bank account. There had been some issues between this employer and Lewis's wife, and Lewis was looking to get even with the employer. Obviously, this didn't work because Lewis got caught. Lewis also fluctuated in his timeline, stating he worked on the extortion letter 3 days prior to the Tylenol murders being published, which only worsened the FBI's tunnel vision on Lewis. And Lewis ultimately submitted to DNA testing and fingerprinting, both of which came back as negative, meaning they didn't match any of the available biological evidence on the Tylenol bottles. Now, if you've watched the documentary, you'll know that James Lewis is a very strange character. He's someone that is very off-putting just by looking at him, and there's a good reason for that. So we're going to talk a little bit about James Lewis's background and some of his previous crimes. James Lewis was born in Memphis, Tennessee, where one day he and his sisters were abandoned in a motel by their mother. This came after their father, consequently, abandoned the family. Lewis was adopted by Charlotte and Floyd Lewis. However, Floyd died rather shortly after the adoption. Charlotte then remarried to a man named Glenn Nelson, and the first sign of troubled history for Lewis came when he attacked his family. Now, some reports state that Lewis attacked his stepfather, others say he attacked his mother, some say that it was with an axe, others say it was not with an axe, so who knows. But regardless, the outcome resulted in him being committed to a state mental health institution. Lewis would later marry Leanne Lewis, and together they would have a daughter named Tony Ann Lewis, who was diagnosed with Down syndrome and ultimately passed away at the age of 5 due to complications from a surgical device meant to assist with a heart defect. At this time, Lewis was particularly close with a man named Raymond West, whom he assisted by way of his business, which centered around taxes. Neighbors and locals in the Kansas area spoke highly of Raymond and noticed when he wasn't out and about for a few days, this concerned him. And so this led to Raymond's friends and neighbors asking for a welfare check. The welfare check resulted in officers finding a note posted on the door on Lewis and Lewis stationery, something that came from Lewis's tax business. And the note claimed that Ray had gone away for a few days and that anyone looking for him should contact Lewis. Police loosely questioned Lewis, who stated that he was just doing what Raymond asked him to do and just relaying the information. When 3 weeks passed and Raymond still hadn't turned up and he still wasn't seen or heard from, police ended up back at his residence in Kansas. After forcing entry into the home, they were met with a very bloody crime scene. There was blood spatter on the ceiling. There was blood spatter on the wall. There was blood spatter on the floor. And there was a trail of blood that led throughout the house. And the trail led towards the attic, where authorities found Raymond's body hanging in the attic by what was described as a pulley system. Raymond's body was also dismembered in some places and tied up in garbage bags. Unfortunately, his body was so decomposed at this point that they couldn't determine a cause of death, but it was likely very violent considering the blood spatter and the cast-off. So naturally, suspicion fell on Lewis again, and locals stated Raymond was growing very uneasy around Lewis. Meanwhile, Lewis claimed that he and Raymond were particularly close. Raymond, according to Lewis, loved Tony, and after Tony's passing, he and Raymond grew closer as friends. As the investigation continued, police found a check totaling $5,000 to Lewis's tax firm. Law enforcement determined that the check was forged. Lewis would claim that it was a loan from Raymond that he intended to repay. On top of this, blood was found on bars of soap in Raymond's house, along with a hair that allegedly matched Lewis. Lewis was charged with murder, but upon discovery that his Miranda rights were violated, the case was thrown out. And for those who don't know, that's something that's called fruit of the poisonous tree, which means that because evidence was found after Lewis's rights were violated, that evidence can't be admitted because there's a chance it would not have been discovered otherwise. So if he had been Mirandized appropriately and accordingly, that evidence may not have been found, so it gets thrown out, and it gets a little complicated. It's frustrating when it happens, but like it exists for a reason, right? Because you don't want wrongful or false convictions. So just keep that in mind. Also, quick fact about Miranda warnings, the way that those apply, right? So a lot of people get concerned and they're like, oh my God, somebody's reading my Miranda warnings. I'm going to jail. Not the case. Miranda warnings have to be read when, one, you are detained, which means you're not free to leave. And two, they're going to ask you questions that are self incriminating. So if I were to show up on a scene and I'm like, hey, you're detained, but I'm not asking you questions about anything you did, I'm asking you questions about what they did, you don't really have to read Miranda warnings. But as soon as I start asking about your behavior, then I would have to read you your Miranda warnings. They're also called Miranda warnings because they're not an inherent right, but they are very important and people should be reading them. And, you should be aware of what you legally can and cannot ask for, whether that's a lawyer, having a parent present, etc. So just, do a little bit of research on when your Miranda warnings are applicable and when they aren't. For instance, they're not applicable on the phone, because you can leave at any point. It's consent based. You accept the phone call, you can end it whenever you want. So just a little education. But back to the main story. So Lewis was also the primary suspect in a case where he abducted a woman who lived in the same building as him. He allegedly used chemicals to sedate or subdue her and then sexually assaulted her. Lewis spent time in jail for this, but the case never went to trial because the victim withdrew her agreement to testify. Reports state that the woman had chemical burns around her mouth, which suggested that some type of chemical weapon, most likely chloroform, was used. But Lewis was never convicted of this. He was, however, convicted of other additional financial crimes. And I want you guys to keep this information in mind for Lewis, because it'll be important later. But for now, we have some other topics to briefly go over before we tie everything together. So let's go ahead and examine the pathology and psychology of terrorism because, let's face it, the Tylenol murders, if done by an individual, are either a terroristic effort or a mass murder effort, or both. And what's particularly interesting when it comes to terrorists is that they don't typically have psychological issues, such as mental illnesses diagnosable in the DSM 5. Terrorists also lack personality disorders, and this is because terrorists often work with small groups of like minded individuals. They're part of an organization, meaning that they have to be able to trust one another without fear that sociopathic Andy over here isn't going to do something stupid and ruin the entire operation just because he can. But that analysis in general applies to terroristic groups and not like a lone individual. And I think if the Tylenol murders were done by a group, there would have been way more casualties, meaning it's more likely that a single person would have been responsible. Additionally, terrorist groups don't have much of a problem with taking ownership of their work. They usually are pretty quick to say, yeah, we did that, because they want to bring fear, loss, violence, and even panic into society. But this is usually done with intent and a very calculated, direct outcome, meaning that a terrorist would have better luck causing mass casualties by infiltrating the Johnson & Johnson plant and contaminating like millions of Tylenol capsules rather than doing one bottle at a time here and there in a store. Terrorism also has a very clear, explicit, and direct goal, often politically driven or even religiously driven. In some instances, it's personally driven, like the Oklahoma City bombing, but we also have to look at the goal of chemical and biological warfare. And while that's the same in many ways as like outright violence with guns or bombs, there's a few differences. The biggest difference is the removal of safety. When it comes to violent terrorism, I guess all terrorism is violent, but like with bombs and guns, right? There's often a sense of security that time, distance, buildings, etc., those can all offer some type of protection. However, chemical agents and other biological substances eliminate that sense of security. It means anyone and everyone can be a potential victim at any given time, at any given location. So, the Tylenol murders, in theory and at face value, may be a case of chemical or biological terrorism. But at the same time, that also doesn't make a lot of sense because when we look at it at the history behind chemical or biological terrorism, large groups in a specific area are targeted, like subways or train stations. Places where a population is dense and the outcome is obvious almost immediate and very direct, which isn't the case with the Tylenol murders. And the fact that so few victims resulted from the contaminated pills leads me to believe that this wasn't an act of terrorism, because if it was, it would have done a lot more damage and would have been way more efficient in killing way more people. So, what about the possibility of mass murder or the psychology of mass murder? Well, let's jump into some of the statistics. In a very interesting study examining over 1,500 instances of mass murder, the following statistics were found. Of the study, 93% of perpetrators were male, so that would fit James. 60% were Caucasian, again, James. 35% were 20 to 29 years old, and 28% were 30 to 39 years old, James. 61% occurred in the US, fits James, or I guess I've been calling him Lewis, but James Lewis. 72% had the perpetrator commit suicide on scene, not applicable. 86% had no history of psychotic symptoms. 82% had no psychiatric issues. Given Lewis and his behavior, I would say that probably fits actually, because, well, no, it wouldn't fit because I'm pretty sure he's got something quite wrong with him. But anywho, 81% had no substance issues. 68% were done with a firearm, and only 32% were done without a firearm. When a cause or motive was analyzed, 57% of the mass murder incidents were fueled by emotional distress. So when we look at those statistics, right, is it likely that James could have done something like this? Sure. But then we get to the bottom part, which is no psychiatric issues. I don't think that that fits James at all. I'm pretty sure he's got psychiatric issues, especially because he was admitted to a mental institution. And 68% were done with a firearm. So if the goal is mass murder, again, most people are going to be very direct about it, and they're going to want to be as violent as possible, which doesn't fit the Tylenol murders. Now, is it possible? Because these are just generalized statistics that some of this is wrong. Absolutely. But definitely something to look at. So if we look at these statistics, we can see that if someone has the goal of mass murder, the Tylenol route really isn't the option most people are going to pick if that is their goal. Especially, like I said, when it appears that most mass murder stems from significant emotional distress. Because at this point in life, Lewis had already served his prison term. He'd already experienced the tragedy of his daughter. There's nothing else that would really trigger that significant emotional distress for him to go and do something like this, unless there's something else that we just don't know about because it's never been publicly reported on, which I suppose is possible. We also have to realize that there is no definitive profile for mass murderers, which is particularly interesting. Psychology has tried to classify these individuals, and we're just not capable of doing it because it's so many demographics, so many backgrounds, it's just very hard. However, research does speculate that mass murder may be motivated by revenge or envy. Some speculate that Lewis had issues with Johnson & Johnson, one, because of the wife that, well, no, that wasn't associated with Johnson & Johnson. I stand corrected on that. Some speculate that it was due to the apparatus that failed with Tony's heart surgery that was reportedly done by Johnson & Johnson. But again, Lewis kind of is wishy-washy on whether or not he's upset at Johnson & Johnson for that. But again, that was forever ago. It would have been more likely that he did something like this to get back at Johnson & Johnson closer to when the tragedy or the incident actually happened. On top of this, research suggests that the adoption of extremist beliefs that promote violence, personality disorders, and antisocial tendencies, as well as social isolation, may contribute to mass murder. Again, not the end-all be-all, because we don't have an actual profile for mass murderers. Now, if we look at all the characteristics, they don't seem to point towards the Tylenol murders being done by a specific person. Because if somebody really wanted to cause mass amounts of harm, they would have done so, right? This reads very much, in my opinion, as a packaging error. On top of that, if we look at the pathology of most poisoning murders, it's women who resort to the use of poison. Or, believe it or not, a lot of times there's been mass poisonings in society. It has been the government. So either it's the government 9 times out of 10, or it's a woman who's doing poisoning. But even if it was women aren't really known to commit mass murder. Like, their poisonings are more isolated, they're more comfort-oriented killers, things like that. So then you kind of go, well, who else would be the most likely perpetrator based on history? And, oh, it's the government. So again, like, I'm not here to be a conspiracy theorist. You just have to look at it logically, right? We also have to look at the alleged crimes that Lewis committed. For instance, the murder of Raymond and then the sexual assault. These were both very intense and very personal crimes. The outcomes were completely within Lewis's control. If he planted cyanide in some capsules for extra strength Tylenol and then put them in a pharmacy, the outcome is so depersonalized from him, it just doesn't make sense. He's not watching the death firsthand or the suffering of the victim firsthand. He's not even like directly involved when it comes to the death itself or the violence itself. There would be no satisfaction in it, no release. And on top of that, he would be regressing, right? Going from violent murder, violent sexual assault, where in the case of the murder, he's dismembering somebody. And then in the sexual assault, he's kidnapping somebody, then turning to just mass attempted poisoning. Like, it's just not something that you see. It just doesn't happen. So the poisoning method also implies a certain type of sophistication that, in my opinion, Lewis just doesn't have, because every crime he's been charged with has been directly linked to him, yet conveniently the Tylenol murders can't be, even when he submitted DNA and fingerprint evidence, right? Like, he can't even write an extortion letter without getting caught. And he went so far as to put a note on his dead friend's door with stationery at his business, like he wouldn't be the prime suspect. It's just ridiculous. Like, this man is not criminally sophisticated enough to pull this off and have it go unsolved for decades. And if they had tested the DNA and it came back to Lewis, that would make sense because he's dumb enough to leave his DNA behind. But the fact that the DNA left isn't even his really says to me that while Lewis is a bad guy, he didn't do the Tylenol murders. In fact, I don't think you can really call these murders in the stereotypical way, because I 100% believe that Johnson & Johnson messed up, and that's why only a few people died and everything ended up hunky-dory shortly later. And I hate being a conspiracy theorist because, again, that's just not who I am. But when you look at it, like, who is the government going to protect? A giant company with billions of dollars to their name, or a guy with a shady past and criminal history who is most likely to be a violent offender? I mean, the conclusion there is kind of obvious. However, Johnson & Johnson stated they did not use cyanide in the production of Tylenol. They very early on came out and was like, there's no cyanide located anywhere in our Tylenol plants, which turned out to be incorrect. They used cyanide on the Tylenol product to test for lead so that they could prevent lead poisoning. And remember when I mentioned that Johnson & Johnson investigated themselves? Yeah, well, any evidence of additional compromised products was never released, because why would you do that if you're investigating yourself, right? You're not going to. You're going to protect yourself. So this means that we will never know how many bottles were actually contaminated across different areas. We also don't know how many victims there actually were, because the documentary actually brings up a good point and mentions that there's a chance that people who took extra strength Tylenol in a retirement home could have passed away overnight and people would have thought it was just natural causes. So there's really no way to know how many additional victims there were and how big the geographical location is, right? It would make more sense if everything only happened in this one specific area of Chicago. But that's not the case. And there's a very real possibility this was across multiple states, and we'll just never know. On top of this, Johnson & Johnson made additional lies about cyanide being present in their facility, because they later stated that while it was present, it was locked up and behind a special security clearance, which was also inaccurate because there was no security or regulation on the cyanide at all. People could just walk in there. And to be honest, Johnson & Johnson's lies were very quickly forgotten and dismissed because they really reacted in a way that no other company had before when it came to making a mistake, because they took a lot of direct actions to try and protect the public, which they should. But the way I see it is, if you weren't concerned about your procedure being flawed, Even when using cyanide, you wouldn't have had to lie about it. If you were 100% certain that this could not have possibly happened, you would have said, yes, we have cyanide in our plant. Yes, X, Y, and Z. No, this could not have happened because of these procedures. But the fact that you had to lie about it and make up a bunch of BS means that there was real legitimate concern that they themselves did mess this up. And what shocks me is how easily the public was swayed to look away from Johnson & Johnson when in all likelihood the deaths were a mistake on their part. Could I be wrong? Yes. I just don't see how a person with malicious intent would do such a bad job at poisoning people when clearly it should have been super easy to do so. Especially if we're to believe that this person was clever enough to never get caught and was clever enough to contaminate multiple bottles in broad daylight. Like, it just doesn't make sense. And for the government to pin everything on Lewis, who, mind you, is not a good guy, is also despicable, because when you look at Lewis, he's just not someone who would be able to pull something like this off. Like, yes, he's a bad guy, but being a suspect for something when realistically there's like no way in hell you could have done that, and having that suspicion on you for 40 years has to suck. Again, not a good guy, but I still feel bad to a certain extent, because like the real perpetrator is capitalism. The real perpetrator is the company. In my opinion, with the research and the background that I have, it is 100% Johnson & Johnson. Again, Lewis's criminal behavior just doesn't fit the type of perpetrator who would resort to mass poisoning. And to be honest, it's just very frustrating how many people believe he did it. Like, it's just baffling to me. Like, yes, he is weird. His interviews are very off-putting. But that doesn't automatically mean that he's responsible for what happened. And if we used our brains a little bit more to really think about the circumstances of the case, I think we would have held Johnson & Johnson more accountable for what happened. But I do think the public is partially at fault here, because it's so much easier to accept the idea that a crazy guy poisoned people than it is to accept the fact that a company's mess up can lead to the deaths of multiple civilians. It's also very terrifying to realize that on a bad day, the government or a company like Johnson & Johnson could literally kill thousands, if not millions, of people. That was something that scared the absolute shit out of me when I came to that realization. I was running on the treadmill and I was like, oh my God, like, I could take Tylenol tomorrow and be dead because the government has some weird psyop or Johnson & Johnson's regulations fail. Like, it is a very difficult thing to sit with, and a lot of people do not want to sit with that thought. So they are going to be more likely to accept the crazy man narrative than the irresponsible capitalist entity making a mistake. So I do not believe that James Lewis is responsible for the Tylenol murders at all. I am a firm believer that it was a mistake by Johnson & Johnson, especially when you look at the fact that this had the potential, if it were to cause mass panic, if it were to be terrorism or mass murder, like, it should have been so much more effective. It should have been done on such a bigger scale, and it wasn't, right? Because even if we go with the theory that, like, he wanted to get back at Johnson & Johnson for the device in his daughter's surgery failing, he could have done so much more than he actually did. Like, it doesn't make sense. And I feel like I'm the only person that's like, oh yeah, there's no way in hell that Lewis did this. I see so many people are being like, well, he's weird, so therefore he did it. I hate to tell you this. There's a lot of really weird people who may have criminal history that didn't end up doing some of the things they're accused of. And I think the FBI 100% got tunnel vision on him and they knew better. I just don't think that they were willing to admit that there could be such a grand scale fuck up, essentially, on Johnson & Johnson's part. That's just my take on it. So that is the Tylenol murders. I hope you guys learned something new. If you support this content, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. You guys are fantastic. Thank you truly from the bottom of my heart for all the support that you have given me. It has been honestly a little overwhelming. I didn't expect my channel to blow up the way that it did, both here on YouTube and on TikTok, and I didn't expect the podcast itself to blow up. You guys are fantastic, and I really do appreciate it. Again, I want to do something for Pride Month. I'm not entirely sure what that is, so if you have any suggestions, please let me know. I'll see what I can do. I just think, especially in today's day and age, where it's getting harder and harder to just be yourself, especially with the current administration. Um, I think that we need to show support, or at least I need to show support in whatever way that is. So if you guys know of like a good charity, a good program, something like that, please let me know. But that is all I have for you today. Next week's episode will be back to the I-45 investigation. I'm going to try and do every other week for those videos. So thank you guys. Please take care of yourselves and please stay safe. And as always, stay psyched out.